morning, everyone. That must have been a pretty exciting event. I just missed. My name is Corinne Van Dalen. I am a clinical instructor at the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, and I will be moderating this panel. And this panel is Louisiana Environmental Advocacy Panel. We have three really great speakers today. First, we have Ann Rolfes. Well, actually, you will be second. That's right. Ann will go second. Ms. Rolfes was born and raised in Lafayette, Louisiana, where many people make their fortunes from the oil industry. She has seen the wealth and poverty created by oil production, and she founded the Louisiana Bucket Brigade to help end pollution and destruction caused by the oil industry. The organization has created cutting-edge tools, including eyewitness pollution maps, and the refinery accident database. They have a great interactive website. I encourage all of you to go check it out. It's really terrific. Ms. Rolfes has a master's in international development from Tulane. And today you'll hear Ms. Rolfes talk about the Vertex refinery, which is across the river from here, the controversial oil recycling facility that is seeking a permit to expand its operations. Among other issues, Ms. Rolfes will discuss the Bucket Brigade's campaign to stop new drilling in the Gulf. We also have Raleigh Hoke. Raleigh Hoke is the campaign director for Gulf Restoration Network. He works with GRN's campaign and organizing staff to develop and implement campaigns that address pressing issues facing the Gulf and Gulf communities. Before becoming campaign director, Mr. Hoke worked for 2 years as GRN's communication director and 5 years as GRN's Mississippi organizer. Mr. Hoke has a BA in political science, also from Tulane. Mr. Hoke will be speaking about coastal issues, including topics involving the state's execution of the master plan, BP restoration funds, how they're being spent, and the dead zone. We also have Kathleen Wascom, Legislative Liaison for the Louisiana Environmental Action Network. Ms. Wascom started as a community activist trying to stop a hazardous waste facility in Baton Rouge, and later worked with conservation and environmental groups, becoming president of Louisiana Wildlife Federation and chair of Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. For the past 20 years, Ms. Wascom has been working on legislative and regulatory issues that affect the environment. Ms. Wascom, who will speak first, will provide an overview of LEAN's legislative and rulemaking agenda for oil field cleanup, fracking, mercury testing, and other important issues for the state. I know she has a lot of issues to discuss. Welcome, Ms. Wascom.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah. As she said, I'm Kathy Wascom from Baton Rouge, a lifelong native of Louisiana, so I've seen the environmental issues firsthand for as long as I can remember. I do the legislative work for LEAN, Louisiana Environmental Action Network. It's a nonprofit environmental organization that's been around since 1986. That's a long life for an environmental organization. Usually they're kind of ad hoc to an issue once the landfill debate is over or the facility debate is over. The environmental groups usually fade away. This one has lasted a long time because there is a state full of people with problems, serious problems, who continually are frustrated and bewildered by the agencies who simply cannot do what they believe they're supposed to do, protect them, protect the environment and their health and welfare. LEAN has, I guess, authority in the state because it does one thing. It goes to court. Louisiana Environmental Action Network was probably one of the first clients of the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic. You can go to the legislature as much as you want and say, this is bad for us, it's bad for our health, it's bad for our community, please do the right thing. But unless you have the ability and the resources to involve yourself in the legal system, you're not going to be paid too much attention. I'm called a legislative liaison. Liaison is, it's a hard word to spell when you're just writing. The reason I'm called a legislative liaison is because I do it as a volunteer. In another world, I would be a plain lobbyist, lobby for the environment. So that's why I have that name. Several years ago, General Russell Honore, retired Lieutenant General Russell Honore, came back to Louisiana, and he saw the Bayou Corn situation and what was going on and not going on, and the people who were so desperate in the agencies that wouldn't respond. So he wanted to involve all the environmental groups in what he called the Green Army. So it's a coalition of environmental groups that go to the legislature and really help to lobby to get more emphasis on environmental issues. The environmental legislation in Louisiana really started when it started a good while back, but it really did not come into prominence until Paul Tremblay was put as Secretary of DEQ under Governor Romer. That was in 1988. And at those years, we actually passed good environmental legislation to clean up the air and the water and the land. And it was 4 years of really good legislation. And since then, little by little by little, industry has brought down the legislation as they do, bit by bit by bit, not a full-scale repeal of any legislation, but a weakening of the legislation. So we continue on. We continue on with wins in the court system, primarily, and now we have access to social media, which is really, really important when you're a grassroots organization to have social media out there to help you, to text, to see what's going on. I was asked to speak about the legislative agenda under Governor Edwards. We put out in 2014 an environmental scorecard. We hadn't done this in a long time, but what we're trying to do is hold the people accountable, hold the legislators accountable. So we published this in 2014. I have copies here, and we published a smaller one in 2015. Governor Edwards was one of our green team. He voted for environmental issues 100% of the time. So when he got elected, we were very optimistic. And one thing the governor can do is appoint people to the different agencies, heads of the agencies that we can work with. When you're with groups like ours, we can serve as a citizen advocacy group for the agencies. If they have rules to make or they have legislation to get through, we can actually help the agencies. And we have had rapport with DNR and Wildlife and Fisheries and DEQ for a long time, but the last 8 years we have simply been cut out. There's no interaction, and actually DEQ and DNR has gone up to the table to oppose legislation that we have. So it's extremely difficult to get things passed when your own agencies come and oppose what you're trying to do. So the ability to appoint heads of agencies is very important, and I think we will have cooperation with the agencies as we go forward. The problem is when you elect the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Louisiana, that Speaker appoints the chair of the different committees. You can have a chair that is fair, or you can have a chair that is simply not going to hear any legislation on environment because the oil and gas and chemical industry do not want it. So when Walt Leger was not elected Speaker of the House, you had a problem with your committees. So again, we are faced with committees whose chair and vice chairs may not necessarily give us a fair hearing on their bills, and they're also the members of the committee are selected. So that was a very difficult situation to see, because Representative Leger is very fair, very honest, very capable, and it was unfortunate that happened, because we would have had an opportunity to hear our legislation presented in a fair manner, because there is a lot of control at the committee level. This year, we're going to keep on with our legislation as we have for years and years and years. We are going to support DEQ's effort to get a fee increase. DEQ does not get general fund money. It gets all its money from fees and fines and penalties that they charge for permits. And for many years, they have not had fee increases. And we are way below surrounding states and what we charge for a permit. So we are going to support DEQ in its effort to increase its fees, because it has to have money to do programs. The agency perhaps had as many as 1,000 employees, and now they're down to 600. So it's very difficult to do a program when you don't have the staff and the equipment to do the programs. We are going this year again to get fence line air monitoring. We have the most complaints from citizens who live close to facilities. And in this area, we have a lot of citizens who live close to facilities that have a lot of air pollution. So we want fence line monitoring along those facilities to let us know what is going on in the facilities. Our biggest complaint is by the time DEQ gets out there or somebody gets out there, the air is dissipated or they can't ever find anything, which is a big problem when you work in environmental communities and they call the agencies and they say, we can't find anything. And the people know what they're breathing, they know what they're seeing, and they become very, very frustrated, very, very angry, very, very despondent. So we want the ability of the agencies to respond to that. Another thing is aquifer protection. Particularly in Baton Rouge, there is saltwater intrusion coming into the aquifer in Baton Rouge. There are facilities above Baton Rouge, specifically Exxon and Georgia Pacific. Instead of using river water, as the companies this way would do, they're using aquifer water for process, simply because it's cheaper. The way they have a right to go and use as much aquifer water as they want. So we are going to try to change the makeup of the commission that oversees these so that the industries who are taking the water are not represented on the commission. So you have the people who are using the water controlling the commission. So we're going to try to get that changed. And we are going to continue with the cleanup of abandoned oil field waste sites. There is a commission that's supposed to be collecting money from oil and gas companies, and that the list is so very long that the commission can only choose the worst ones to put money in to clean up. We want an increase in that spending, and we were very supportive of the lawsuits to have the oil and gas companies clean up down at the legislature. We have in Louisiana legislation by crises. That means when you have Bayou Corn, Rig Ruckus, you go down and they'll have legislation about salt domes because the Bayou Corn situation. You're going to have BP oil spill, and really, there wasn't that much legislation. You would have thought you had a huge major disaster, but there really wasn't that much legislation to tell the oil and gas companies they need to clean up. They need to watch what they do. And then we have water contamination right now. If you've read about St. Joseph, a little small town in Tensas Parish, we're looking at that issue too. But everything that we go through and things that are things that come up, so it's never proactive. It's always reactive. That's why we're trying to put in air monitoring, some control on water contamination. We're also trying to work with DEQ and make sure they are reestablishing the mercury program. We used to test for mercury in the fish. They used to put up signs so that if a water body was contaminated, that you would know, so you wouldn't feed that fish to your children or to a pregnant woman, because it was harmful for fetal development. So when the gentleman doing the program retired, the program just went away. And so now it's going to be revised, we hope. But when the Jindal administration came in, that program died when the man who managed it retired. So we want mercury looked at again, and we have a lot of mercury contamination in the state. And then when you talk to legislators, they become very offended if they are not considered environmentally friendly, because they support coastal restoration. So coastal restoration is something we wholeheartedly support, but it is not the same as environmental regulation, controlling contamination. And we have people who will wave that flag for coastal restoration, but vote against anything to deal with climate change. In fact, the Clean Power Plant, there was the Clean Power Plan, our legislature voted to, go to court and oppose it, though Louisiana doesn't even use that much coal for electricity. But it's something that needs to constantly be presented to them. Because you're for coastal restoration, you have to look at emissions, you have to look at climate change, and you have to look at sea level rise to see how these are impacting. So that is kind of the issues that we have to take up in the legislature. And that is about all I have to say right now. But how you can help. You all have, all of those legislators now have their smartphones with them and everything else. So when legislation comes up, if you can text and get your friends to text and your friends of your friends to text, that will mean a lot, for us. Because we don't have the money and we don't have the influence down at the legislature. We can get a whole room of people there, a whole community there. We can outline the problems, but if the Oil and Gas and the Chemical Association are opposed to it, we have an extremely difficult time unless it's put out in social media, unless the media picks it up, and unless people are made to feel shameful about what they do. In this administration, we are going to have to do what an old friend of mine called a policy of haul ass and bypass, is what they called it. So that you have to, if you can't get it through the legislative process, if you can't even get a bill out of committee, then you have to figure out to go through executive orders, through rulemaking, through using the public that and getting as much media as you can, that's the way you're going to have to do it. So we're quite familiar with that. And then our last recourse is to use the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic or to go to court. And one of our many friends to go to court. The power and the ability to go to court, it cannot be underestimated. That's the only reason when Lean sends a letter saying, we're going to sue you, the companies actually know that we're going to sue you. So that you actually have power through the court system and through the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, who helps us a whole lot. Thank you. One moment.
This is one of those moments where I do want you to get out your cell phone while I'm talking. And you'll understand why, or if you read the flyer, why we want you to text the word Superdome to 88202. But I'll get to that in a minute. My name is Ann Rolfes, and I am with the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. And I work with people who live next to oil refineries and chemical plants, and who live every day with pollution from these facilities. And what I'm going to talk about today are two ways of looking at this issue with fossil fuels. I am going to be talking specifically about the oil industry, but we all know it's part of a greater industry, the fossil fuels. On the micro level, I'm going to look at a refinery called Vertex, and at a greater level, I'm going to look at a movement that we are working, many of us in this room are working on, to get off of fossil fuels altogether. And then a sort of sub-theme is the fact that the oil industry, in particular, will not face facts, not just here in Louisiana, but in general. All right, and so I'll be highlighting some of those facts that they won't face. And I should have brought a little bell or something to ring every time I mention a fact they won't face, but I'll figure something out. Vertex Refinery is across the river. It's just about 1.5 miles or 2 miles across the river, and people from uptown New Orleans report odors from the facility. And we have an eyewitness pollution map, and these are some of the reports to the map, just so that you get an idea of what people are living with. One from just last month, I was home from work almost 2 days this week from a migraine from the odors. I'm a single mother. My time is valuable, and I need to be able to function to take care of my son. A second report was I live 2 blocks from Vertex in Marrero. I often smell a funky old smell coming from their direction. It causes my daughter's bronchitis to flare up, and her asthma becomes uncontrollable. So those are some idea of what people live with: losing jobs and headaches, and your child can't breathe. At a hearing that the Department of Environmental Quality had for the facility to talk about its expansion that it's applying for, one of the parents in the neighborhood read a report from a nun who is the principal at a local school, and she talks about how she has to move infants from one of the rooms because the chemical smells get so bad. All right, so we have a nun here talking about moving babies. It's a pretty, could you get a better witness than that? No, all right? So even with this as the status quo, Vertex wants to expand from 3,000 barrels a day to 6,000. And the fact that this is even under consideration when you have a nun moving infants is beyond comprehension, but as Kathy pointed out, that's Louisiana. So at this hearing, the Vertex environmental manager stood up and showed a photograph of the facility and the river. And it was a picture that had been taken in a slanted fashion so that all you saw was the facility and the river. And she emphasized that it was an industrial area, not mentioning that the Immaculate Conception School is 1/2 mile away and that many people live, as the woman described, 2 blocks away, right? It is a residential area that happens to have some industry there. So here we go, ding-a-ling-a-ling. fiction, right, that the industry does not face, that they are right next to people and people are being impacted. Right? And I know that at hearings that many of you in this room have been to, certainly you, Mike, the industry will routinely offer these permits and pretend as if nobody lives there. In the case of Vertex, we have some good news, which is that Representative Connick, who is the state representative, is actually, shockingly, leading the charge against the expansion. I've been doing this work in this state since 1999. It is the first time I've ever seen somebody, a state representative, stand up against an expansion. So it's, on the one hand, it's horrible that nobody stood up till now, but of course it's good news that he's doing something about it. Here's another fiction, ding-a-ling-a-ling-ling, that the industry tries to emphasize or tries to put forth, that it's Representative Connick in this case who is whipping everybody to a frenzy, that without him there, no one would think that there was a problem. This directly is pretty profound, that you are going to treat adults as if they don't know when they have a headache, that a mother can't see when her son can't breathe, that she doesn't have her own agency to see when that is happening, that it is me or it is Representative Connick or some other person who is making them think this. This happens in every single neighborhood. They find a boogeyman. And the plant manager will point to the boogeyman and act as if people can't speak for themselves. Oftentimes, the community, often but not always, but usually the communities are African American, and this, it's reprehensible that the African American communities and the Native communities are the ones that are getting nailed by this pollution, but that they aren't even given the credit to be able to acknowledge their own situation. I mean, unbelievable, right? So these are dynamics we're seeing in the Vertex situation, and we are hopefully going to be able to stop this expansion. We have a chance since there is a state representative involved. We'll see what happens. But I'm telling you, it's certainly not a sure thing that we can stop this. I'm not sure that we're going to win it because the system is broken, as Kathy pointed out. The legislature, these guys are bought and paid for. Neil Abramson is one of the representatives in this district, in this area, maybe not right here, but in this area, works for Lisco and Lewis, Big Oil as his client, just as an example. The Department of Environmental Quality, the Inspector General of the Environmental Protection Agency did an analysis of enforcement in the United States and was looking at why in our region of the Environmental Protection Agency enforcement is so poor. And he wrote that in Louisiana, it's the worst in the country. In Louisiana, there is a culture in which the agency is expected to protect industry. When we go to the facilities to ask them to put in the simplest of things, air monitors, don't expand when you're giving and making a nun move infants. The only way we win is if we drag them through the mud in the media for years, right? The governor, as much goodwill as he may have, one of his very first acts was to ask the Department of the Interior not to enforce some laws that were created after the BP disaster. He has since done some good things, but he's living in the same reality we are with our legislature. So the system is absolutely broken. Of course we get some bare protections. This is not India, right? We do have some protections, but the system as it was designed to work is absolutely broken. So what do we do with that? Well, in regard to advocacy, it needs to include a paradigm shift. I've spent 17 years now, please put in air monitors, please, don't expand, asking them. It's really been a situation of supplication. And it's long past time for us to set the agenda, right? So that's what this flyer is about, right? Setting the agenda or changing the paradigm can seem like very vague, but we actually have a very specific opportunity to do that on March 23rd. On March 23rd of this year, the Department of the Interior will be auctioning, I think it most recently says 45 million acres of our Gulf of Mexico to the oil industry so that they can go and drill at their leisure. This is the 8th largest source of carbon pollution on the planet. Ring-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, we cannot burn this and stay alive, right? It cannot happen. This has to stay in the ground. So there are a number of groups working here. on this subject. I happen to be standing here, but I just want to acknowledge Renata Brown from 350 Louisiana, Jonathan Henderson from Vanishing Earth, and Sharif Voitlin, who's with Bridge the Gulf, who are absolutely leading this event and this campaign. And what we're calling for is an end to new leases in the Gulf of Mexico. This is actually a seismic shift, even for the environmental and public health community in Louisiana. It is nothing we've ever called for before, honestly, in large part because I've been scared to ask for it, right? It seems heretical in Louisiana to ask for a cease on new leases, but it's absolutely what needs to happen. We cannot burn what is currently underground. And so, in this way, this particular action here in New Orleans is part of the larger movement across the country to keep it in the ground. And the strategy has been to focus on the Department of Interior and ask them not to lease federal lands to these companies. And we had a great victory a couple of months ago when Obama banned coal leases on federal grounds. So these things can seem impossible, but actually the coal ban seemed impossible just a few years ago, and it's happened. So this is absolutely what needs to happen. On March 23rd, our plan is to surround the Superdome. I mean, can you imagine? We need a lot of people, all right? Hello. Raise your hand if you live in Nebraska and you're going to come here for that. All right, so she's coming all the way from Nebraska on March 23rd. So if she can come all the way from Nebraska, then you can certainly take time to come. We absolutely need you. And if you can do a little arm stretching exercises between now and then, that would really help because we need to surround that Superdome. So in case people aren't clear on why we need to surround the Superdome, I just want to run through a list of some of the issues with the oil industry. Killing sea life, destroying fisheries, destroying oysters. When you destroy oysters and fish, you then destroy our culture. I remember after the BP disaster, I'm from Lafayette, I thought, well, we still have boudin and crawfish. But, you know, I love boudin and crawfish, but we shouldn't have to cling to boudin and crawfish, right? When you kill our seafood and our environment, you're killing our culture. Coastal loss, right? By the industry's own admission, they are responsible for at very least a third of the loss of our coast because they were carving up our wetlands for canals, right? Major dissonance, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, they are saying, you know, that they're refusing to pay for repairing our coast, even while their own study acknowledged that they're the cause of the coastal destruction. Air pollution, water pollution, health problems. Those are some of the reasons we need to stop this and get off of oil and fossil fuels once and for all. I know that I mentioned it before, but you know, you cannot underestimate the disproportionate burden that African American communities have borne from this. In Louisiana, although a third of our population is African American, when you look at who lives right next to refineries, over half of the population is African American. All of us in Louisiana are affected and touched by this pollution and by the really a reckless industry, but African American communities have been in the bullseye forever. It has destroyed their property value, a really terrible situation. On the subject of not acknowledging reality, another ring-a-ling-a-ling, on the coast. If any of you are on Facebook, you might have seen the really nauseating ads, the Grow Louisiana Coalition, you know, the oil industry's attempt at grassroots, you know, pretending like they have a grassroots movement. Look at their picture of Louisiana, right? It's a boot like the one I'm wearing. I mean, it shows none of the variations of coast, and it certainly does not show the accurate maps of coastal loss, right? Major dissonance going on there with that map representing our state. Another giant ring-a-ling-a-ling, accidents. The industry has an accident problem, right? By their own reports to the National Response Center, which Jonathan, you know, surveys from the air over the Gulf of Mexico, thousands of accidents every year in the Gulf of Mexico, and our research of the refinery accidents onshore show that for a 10-year block from 2005 to 2015, they averaged 6 accidents every week onshore. right? And yet when we train residents to report those accidents, this is what the oil industry says. They wrote a blog about this. How can people possibly know what's going on in a refinery? You're not an expert. And our retort, of course, was that, well, you don't have to be an expert to call the fire department, to call 911. You can see and smell and feel when there's a problem, right? So the industry absolutely has its head in the sand about accidents. So with all these bells I've been ringing, you can see that if you don't believe our coast is eroding, if you don't believe you have an accident problem, if you don't believe that you are making people sick, and if you actually don't even believe that people are near you, then of course you don't think that your operation should change in any way. These guys are living in a fairy tale. I don't know if they mean to be lying or if they just truly believe it. And it doesn't really matter because the end result is they just keep up these very, very dangerous operations. So I'm calling out the oil industry for their fictions, and yet we need to address some issues on our side. When we were at that Vertex hearing, there have been a couple of them. So just on Wednesday, I was at one before the Jefferson Parish Council. And Vertex brought several of its employees, these men in jumpsuits that say Vertex on it. And as I walked out, I thought, I cannot walk by these men, right? I cannot pretend like, that they don't matter or that we don't actually have an issue to discuss. And so what I had been advocating was air monitoring. So I just stopped and I talked with a gentleman about air monitoring, and they were extremely interested in it. And I made the point, and they saw it immediately, that if we had air monitoring and so many of the other things that we recommend, it would actually create a lot of jobs. And so on our side, we have to honestly reckon with this jobs issue. To me, it's the only argument that the oil industry has. The only argument they have is jobs. So let's look at jobs. Very interesting. When Jonathan and Aaron Viles and I and Alicia Cook from 350 were in front of the Superdome announcing this action about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the oil industry's retort through the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association was 40,000 jobs. 40,000 jobs, right? We're calling not just for a ban on new leases, but also for an immediate hiring of 1,000 people. And he said, that doesn't matter. You risk 40,000 jobs. Go and look at the data. The data for Louisiana and our Bureau of Labor says currently 8,000, no, it's not even 8,000, I'm rounding up, I'm generous. 8,000 people are employed on these rigs or by other companies, all right? It is not 40,000, their numbers are hooey, and they need to be called on it. The other issue is that he's obviously assuming that, boom, 40,000 people could be hired once this auction takes place, and that's not true. So major ring-a-ling-a-ling, they are not telling the truth about jobs. The job situation is the challenge here, and we can address it if we are honest about it. Throwing out these bogus figures is a disservice to this state, because you know what? This state has got to transition, right? If we cling to oil, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to quote Oliver Howe, a great article, Who Will Pay to Fix the Coast? He wrote in The Nation a couple of years ago. We remain married, Louisiana and the oil industry, at least until the industry leaves us, as it surely will after a few more heady years, with only the memories and a wasted skin. Okay, that's pretty gross imagery, but it makes the point. So the jobs issue, where the jobs come from in this transition is repairing their terrible infrastructure, right? They've got a lot of leaky pipes and platforms that are in terrible shape. Onshore, I have a picture of an Exxon valve with plastic bags and duct tape on it, right? So they need to hire people to replace and repair the infrastructure. They need to hire more people to run these facilities more safely. And certainly a lot of jobs could be had to repair our coast. This is the sort of thing we need white papers on. I mean, for example, you could have something like a transition fund that the oil industries pay for. We could start up big training programs at community colleges, right? The industry really uses the community college system well for its current workforce. So it seems like a big change, if we just even start to conceptualize about getting Louisiana off of oil, getting rid of this state as the sacrifice zone, transitioning away. It seems like it couldn't happen. I mean, I'm from Lafayette. What? Who could say that? I should hide. But in fact, this state, this region has faced a much bigger system in the system of slavery, right? We were economically dependent or not economically dependent. The system was bought off by slavery. Certainly the political system was bought off, and it took a war to end it, right? I don't think we need a war, but we need to honestly look at what's happening. I just want to end by saying that there are a lot of people in this room. I just mentioned the people who and the groups who were involved in this March 23rd action. Oh, please text the Superdome to 88202. You can get text alerts about this. But there are a lot of people in this room who have done wonderful work for many years. I'm honored to be between Raleigh and Kathy, and I can get weepy about this. I just want to congratulate Kathy in particular. You know, what she did not tell you is that she has sat, how many years have you been doing this?
25.
Okay, 25 years. She has sat, yeah, just applause for that. But she hasn't just been attending, she's actually been ridiculed and insulted and had to sit in front of people who have all the power. I mean, think what that's like, to be in these committee rooms with these men who are, you know, you don't have a chance, really. And yet, in the long run, we do have a chance. And I'm sure that's the vision that you've gone with. You know, this is a movement. We look forward to seeing you March 23rd at the Superdome. Thank you all.
It's a tough act to follow, Ann. So my name is Raleigh Hoke. I'm the campaign director with Gulf Restoration Network, and I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the what this new administration means and some of the opportunities that I see with this new governor. How do I move this thing? So quickly, Gulf Restoration Network, we were founded in 1994. Our mission is to unite and empower people to protect and restore the natural resources of the Gulf of Mexico. So we work in all 5 Gulf states, but we have most of our staff is based here in Louisiana, and we do a lot of work in Louisiana. We use tools such as organizing, advocacy, litigation, sometimes with the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, and watchdogging to ensure that industry and the government are doing the right things for the health of the Gulf of Mexico. So some of the issues we work on is energy and climate change, water and wetlands, coast and communities, and oceans and marine life. And today I'm going to focus in on 2 particular issues and talk a little bit about what this new administration can do and how it can improve on what the Jindal administration has done in the past. One is coastal wetlands loss, which I think most of us are pretty familiar with, and one is the Gulf Dead Zone. So just a quick kind of reminder of the crisis we're facing here in Louisiana. This is a picture of what our coast looked like in 1839. 1870, 1993, and projected into 2020. So we're the fastest disappearing landmass in the world. We lose a football field's worth of wetlands every hour. I'm sure y'all have heard that statistic way too many times. And why does it matter? I think Ann did a good job of talking about why it matters. It's about our culture. It's about seafood. And really it's about protecting our coastal communities, protecting communities like New Orleans. Every 3 to 4 miles of wetlands reduces storm surge by 1 foot. So our communications specialist says this picture is creepy. What do you guys think? A little bit? Yeah, okay. Maybe I'll take that out in the next time, you know. So we have this major crisis, but we also have a plan to restore the coast. It's the Louisiana Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast. It's a 50-year, $50 billion plan. It's great, or it's okay. It's a good step forward. But the problem is that we don't have that $50 billion yet. We don't have the money to really pay for this plan. So politicians, we have Edwards and Jindal here. You guys are missing Jindal, right? So politicians across the state, everyone pays lip service to coastal restoration. Everyone says that they're committed to restoring our coast. These are a couple of quotes from Jindal. He said, "We must begin to fund the projects on our state's master plan immediately so that we can get to work on protecting our coast." That was in 2008. Governor Edwards on the campaign trail saying, "We need to show the nation that this issue is worthy of national investment. We need to prove to people in other parts of America why they need to care about coastal issues in Louisiana." You won't find a politician in Louisiana who won't at least say that we need to restore the coast. But the question is whether or not they actually follow through with actions on this. So in 2008, Governor Jindal even issued an executive order that directed all state agencies to administer their regulatory practices, programs, contract grants, etc., in accordance with the state master plan. But did we actually see that happen? Not really. One of the issues is that the state has really continued to permit destructive projects that are either destroying wetlands that we need, wetlands that are coastal wetlands, or actively interfering with the master plan and restoration plans. So these are some pictures of some coal plants or coal export terminals in Plaquemines Parish here in Louisiana, mostly taken by Jonathan back there. This is the IMT terminal as well as the UBT terminal. We've already seen through our monitoring work that these existing facilities are polluting coastal restoration sites like the Lake Hermitage site. This is my colleague Scott holding some coal. Scott? So we already see that these coal export terminals are negatively affecting coastal wetlands, negatively affecting restoration sites. But despite that, the state has approved the Ram Coal Export Terminal, which is a coal export terminal in Plaquemines Parish directly adjacent to the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. This sediment diversion is basically one of the premier restoration projects in the master plan. It's really one of the first big tests of if these large-scale sediment diversions are going to work and how they're going to work. Scientists at the contracted by the state at the Water Institute have raised serious concerns about how this coal export terminal would impact this diversion. Yet despite that, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is really the state agency that's tasked with implementing the master plan, has entered into an agreement with RAM allowing them to move forward on this project. In addition, the DEQ actually issued a coastal use permit that we sued over that and has since been revoked. Woohoo! This is a little bit more about where it is. So this coal export terminal would be right next to the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion and also next to Ironton, Louisiana, which is a historically African-American community that has faced many, many, many environmental justice issues over the years. Well, we had a big victory, like I mentioned. We won our court battle to get RAM's coastal use permit thrown out. They've reapplied, and we're waiting to see what happens next. The Plaquemines Parish Council has denied RAM its construction permit, and communities across southeast Louisiana have passed resolutions in opposition to this project. So I think the question is, local communities are really standing up for coast over coal, but what about the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority? Under Governor Jindal, this was not the case, but under Governor Edwards, we hope to see the Restoration Authority actually do its job. The state could also play a much bigger role in making sure that dirty energy companies are held accountable for their spills, for their accidents, and also for their role in our coastal wetlands loss. Ann mentioned that oil and gas is responsible for at least a third of our coastal wetlands loss. That's the industry's estimates. Some studies put it up to 89% of our coastal land loss if you look at the kind of higher end of that estimate. So we had in 2013, for the first time, a kind of a quasi-state agency actually moved to hold these oil and gas companies accountable when the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East sued over 90 oil and gas companies for their role in the coastal wetlands loss. As soon as that happened, Governor Jindal immediately came out and did everything he could, both publicly through the media as well as through appointments to the board, through the legislature, to squash this lawsuit. It's still moving forward, but just barely. It's on appeal right now. And the new governor really has an opportunity to let the levee board and the people it represents have our day in court. Just let us have our day in court, because that's really what Governor Jindal is preventing. And then legal action isn't the only way that the new administration can hold companies accountable. In many cases, it's just about enforcing existing laws. The levee board lawsuit, as well as some lawsuits by some of the local parishes, are really focused on, hey, you had this permit. You said in this permit that when you're done, you would mitigate the damage that was done by this activity. In many cases, the state has never forced them to do that. And through relatively cheap methods like just backfilling old canals, you can have really significant restoration. According to Scott's research on this, the backfilling of unused canals in the Barataria Terrebonne alone would conservatively restore over 7,000 football fields worth of wetlands, or 10 square miles. The Jindal administration also made a mistake in not really always using restoration dollars on restoration. I think one of the most recent and egregious examples was Governor Jindal, former Governor Jindal, asking for part of BP money to be diverted to the Louisiana 1 bridge project. Ultimately, this was defeated, though the compromise that came up was almost more problematic because it says that 10% of offshore royalties moving forward can be used for infrastructure projects. Then candidate Edwards said about this, coastal restoration dollars should be dedicated to coastal restoration. So I'm hopeful, or I hope that he follows through on that promise. You know, this is a really dangerous precedent, using restoration dollars for things besides restoration. I think it comes back to what that quote I started with from Governor Edwards, where he says that we need a national commitment to coastal restoration. Well, if we're going to get a national commitment to coastal restoration, we can't be permitting destructive projects. We can't be putting coal export terminals right next to premier restoration projects. We can't be diverting money to infrastructure. And we can't be letting oil and gas companies get away with murder. If we're going to get the nation to commit to us, we also need to commit to coastal restoration. We need to show that we're serious as a state and as a government that we're going to do this. Similarly, the dead zone. Are y'all familiar with that? Anyone? Cool. So the dead zone is this area of low oxygen that forms off the coast of Louisiana and Texas every summer. It's caused by nitrogen and phosphorus pollution washing down from the Mississippi River Basin, which is about, 41% of the U.S., contiguous U.S., drains into the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi River. It's caused by agricultural runoff, factory farming, pigs, and sewage pollution are the main causes. Here's a little graph about what the process is, but I'm going to skip this. So this is the dead zone last summer. It was the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. So what's Louisiana doing about the dead zone? Very similarly, the dead zone is an issue that we can't tackle by ourselves. We need a national commitment, or at least a commitment from all the states in the Mississippi River Basin. But Louisiana needs to be a leader on this if we're going to ask other states to make sacrifices to fix our problem. Now, we're the state that's most impacted by the dead zone. We have a $1.9 billion seafood industry that's impacted every summer. But what are our leaders doing? Under the Jindal administration, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality repeatedly tried to get the dead zone off of the impaired waters list, which is basically a list of waters that need cleanup and that we need a plan to clean up. They said, oh, it's not a problem. We don't want to deal with that. The state of Louisiana even filed a brief in support of a lawsuit in the Chesapeake Bay that was trying to get rid of a cleanup plan in Chesapeake Bay that was very similar because they were worried that, oh, if they're going to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, this might be a precedent for Louisiana. So we joined this lawsuit. So while the majority of the pollution that causes the dead zone isn't coming from Louisiana, again, we need to be a leader on this issue, and we need to show other states that we're serious about doing this. So just in conclusion, the new governor has a major opportunity to show that we're ready to tackle these issues and be serious about it. We can't tackle these challenges alone, but we can show the rest of the country that we're ready and able to do our part to solve the coastal land loss crisis, to fix the dead zone, to reduce the dead zone. And let's hope we actually do it. That'd be good. So, thank you.
Well, now for the interactive part. I wish I had a big table up here so that those with questions could see the panelists clearly, but instead I thought we can put chairs right here, and if you need the mic, it's right here. And I see your hand up already, so as soon as we get settled here, maybe I'll even do this now. That helps. All right. Okay. Sir, I think you had the first question.
Yes. Allow me, please, move the pulpit for just a second. I'd like to relate two incidents directly related to what these people are talking about. And then I'll ask the questions, or ask for support in one area. The two incidents I'm referring to are the last FERC board meeting that I went to. And prior to that was how best I can call it, is an exhibition on the part of NOAA and the Sea Grant people. And if you are here and offended by what I say, I'll be glad to argue the point. Let's go to the second one first. It was a toxicology presentation on toxicology in the Gulf of Mexico, in which they used the standard minnow for determination of toxicology levels where the fatal, the 50% kill-off is an indication of toxicity. That, first of all, that is the hardiest in animal you probably could check, even though it is a standard, and I admit that. No larval testing of crab, fish, or shrimp, or any other thing. That was it, just the minimum. That's my first objection. The toxicology level and the beautiful presentation they gave with the slides and all that, and all the science connected with that, was fine with me because I didn't participate. And it looked genuine and real. But what really got my gall was the presentation of another slide wherein Dawn liquid was shown to be more toxic than all of the other particle and fluid portions of contamination. The bad science is that if you can clean a whole dish load with a drop of Dawn, but the concentration factor was not considered and not brought up. And when it was sort of pointed out in the meeting that no larval testing had been done, we promised it's going to happen, and there was a problem with the Dawn figures, the group exited quickly. All right, so I just want to bring that up as an issue of science to discuss in just a second. The second issue was at the SIPR board meeting, which was a beautiful presentation of the results of the diversion projects so far, 4 diversion projects in the lower Mississippi. The first upper 2 were admitted to be abandoned because they just weren't working. One of the lower diversion projects had in fact worked well enough to connect enough data to show that in 50 years there would probably build 47,000 acres in 50 years. And the project included tons of data about flow. Obviously very, very precisely done by whoever was doing it, the contractor or whatever. Obviously good science, well, that's metaphor. But my question to them was simply this. If I go to Google and Google silt content from 50 years ago at the areas you diverted to silt content today, what would I find? And the question, and I think it's obvious that with the dams that have been constructed since the 60s and 50s and that's coming down the Mississippi now, that silt content of the river is less than it was before. That should have been included in the preliminary studies before we talked about diversions, before we spent millions of dollars for these diversion projects. Okay, so my appeal to this group is simply on just that basis. And I'm sure a lot of you here could tell me a lot of other instances about faulty science. But my appeal to the environmental groups and to all the agencies concerned is that when you approach them, let's not leave Ann alone. Let's not leave all of these people alone when they approach a legislator or a body that can determine where this one is going to go. Drag a scientist with you who is informed, if you can get one. If you can get one.
Yeah, I think it's the point. It's the point about these fictions. I mean, that Dawn did. I think we have. They're the ones who say you need a scientist to prove that Dawn liquid. Like, no, we don't. We actually have common sense. After BP, I was at a presentation in which we were told we were talking about Corexit. They said, "Do you eat Klondike bars?" Because it's the same chemical in a Klondike bar. I mean, this is nonsense. And so we just need common sense, and we need to call them out on it because
I agree.
It's a fiction and they're ruining our state and our region.
I agree with you. I understand your point. What I'm suggesting is we need to point out that some of these people, for instance at LSU, and you know who they are, were fired for speaking up on campus.
This has been going on.
That is denying science its real voice. And that is, excuse me, philosophically speaking, an assault on truth, as you well know.
It's been going
at that level.
on for a long time. I had a manager of Dow Chemical who I was at lunch with, put some salt on the table and said, "You don't have to worry about chlorine. It's just salt." And so in this, I had a lobby representative said, toluene, benzene, you don't have to worry about those. Those are in fingernail polish remover, stuff that we use every day, so that when you're a legislator, you're thinking, well, fingernail polish remover can't be that harmful to the people. It's an old-time bait and switch, and it's used all over, especially to make people feel diminished, that they don't know what they're talking about, that they are inferior. And Lean, as well as these other groups here, we have technical people, and we have the ability to say, no, this is what chlorine does for you. It's not salt. And same way with the vinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride was in contaminating water, all adjacent to Dow Chemical. People came in, EPA came in, Tulane Health people came in. There's no problem because vinyl chloride is going to volatilize when it gets up. So you don't have to worry about the concentration in drinking water. So so Dow did clean up, but they never took responsibility for the vinyl chloride in the aquifer system there. So that this happens constantly, and it makes people afraid to approach their legislator. It uses the old bait and switch tactic that's been, as long as the tobacco industry, you can't prove what chemical in cigarettes causes cancer, and so people who've been doing this long enough, they know that the bait and switch, and they can't take it, but
in any way.
but
I did not mean to impugn anything you've done in the past.
oh no, it's just
I'm
that
just
that's what
wondering,
happens.
In this state, ground truth is ignored, and you know it better than I do.
There, so
I did not mean in any way to impugn.
no, just you have to question these folks when they make ridiculous things like about Dawn. That's not what we're talking about. That's the old bait and switch that's been used for 1,000 years. It's just new to the people who are doing it, so.
I'm going to take another question. Yes.
I have a question about what we're all seeing is that sharp sort of bottoming out of the value of oil internationally right now, and a lot of people are seeing, obviously, a change in the state of what that's meaning for the industry. I'm curious about what you're seeing, how that matches up with Vertex wanting to double the size of their refinery, or how you see that actually impacting going forward the oil and gas industry continuing to have that power and have that, we need to make all these jobs, earn all this money.
I'm sure that there is an economics answer to this, which I actually don't have. But what I think it speaks to the larger point of them failing to acknowledge reality, right? I mean, right now prices are low because the Saudis are flooding the market to try to, drive people out of business, all right? That's what's happening now. But for example, all the activism around, like Bold, Nebraska, stopping the Keystone Pipeline, there are a lot of the divest movement. There are a lot of landmines in their path. And I think that the way they're looking at the bottom out of prices now is in historical context that prices have always bounced back. So I was a little kid in Lafayette in the 70s and 80s when the oil prices tanked, the local economy was devastated, it came back. And that's what they think right now. They think, oh, it's going to come back. It's going to be like it always was. There won't be any problem. But in fact, we need to, now's the time. This is showing our vulnerability. It's the time to get ourselves off the crack. Yes.
The question about Vertex, I read that Vertex is a refinery of waste oil.
Yeah, exactly. Of recycled oil,
So
yes.
It's a different economic
Yes.
situation altogether. Your crankcase oil, when it goes somewhere, they're re-refining it. So it's actually a recycling project.
Yeah, and he has a real, Ben Coward, who is the CEO in Houston, has this very passionate argument about how he's green and everything. And not hurting it. I mean, it is compelling. Yeah, we should recycle oil. We shouldn't dump on the neighbors while we do it.
But you shouldn't be emitting.
Oh, exactly. I mean, again, this dissonance. I mean, we all live with dissonance in our lives, but it's very glaring.
Y'all spoke a lot about sticks to try to get these companies to do things. Are there any carrots that we can offer to try to get them taxes? Anything to get them to help do
Well,
something?
when it comes to the coastal land loss crisis, I think one thing that eventually might have to bring them to the table is the fact that there's so much oil and gas infrastructure that's protected by our coastal wetlands as well. And, you know, Louisiana's a small state. We're not going to be able to pay for the $50 billion debt. You know, the taxpayers cannot bear that burden alone. So these companies, if they want to have the protection of the coastal wetlands, then they're going to need to, you know, invest in restoration as well. Unfortunately, many of them are investing in putting levees around their facilities right now and things like that, you know, protecting themselves. But
Yeah, and I just want to add, no. I mean, I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist by nature, but no, Exxon doesn't make $40 billion every year by listening to the little old lady across the street. They do not. Every single time we begin by asking for a meeting, would you please meet with your neighbors? I know y'all do too. Let's do the right thing. No, they do not respond to carrots of any kind.
I want to, as we do this financial crisis at the state, the oil and gas industry, the amount of money is anywhere between 13 to 15%. People don't understand that. At one time, perhaps it was 60% of the money coming into the state is very diminished. So that when you talk about the price of oil, it does contribute some, but it's not the percentage that it used to be. In this state, we have huge industrial tax exemptions for facilities. When you get an industrial tax exemption, lo and behold, the mayor doesn't know that he is not going to get property taxes for at least 10 years from that wonderful facility that they thought was going to come in and bring all this money. So they're stuck with that tax exemption that keeps going on and on and on, besides a whole slew of other economic zone exemptions from taxes. So all that needs is, I hope they're going to look at that this session. So there have been, there's lots and lots of carrots out there that are being taken advantage of, but their responsibility to make a product in a safe manner and to clean up the mess you made is simply they do.
You've had your hand up for a while, and then we'll take a question from this side of the room, which hasn't gotten any attention yet. Yeah.
So what y'all are describing basically the political problem, the ownership, control of the governmental process, political process. Are there any environmentally based political activity in Louisiana? Or are we just content to deal with the periphery of it, symptoms?
I consider the March 23rd action to be political action. I mean, we get the numbers we need around that Superdome. I believe that changes things. I think people will be shocked when we pull that off. And I think the politicians take notice.
How many people do you need?
About 2,000.
See a bunch of hands, yes.
So someone was asking a question about mayors or said something about mayors earlier. I know there's conversations been going a lot about what we can get the governor to do. Like, is there any, like, pressure on Landrieu or, like, at the local level for mayors to do things? Because I think in the past, like, 10 years, most social progress has been because mayors made certain decisions in cities that didn't, like, went nationally. So what can be done, like, locally to push, like, a mayor?
Good question.
you know, one of the things that we work on is here in New Orleans is pushing the mayor and the city council and other decision makers on the city level to implement like better stormwater management practices. Because right now, basically what we do is when it rains, we just pump the water out as fast as we can. And that's expensive, it's causes pollution into sort of like concentrations around water bodies, and it's also leads to subsidence, because when we take that water out of the water table, the ground sinks. So it's just really not a good method of dealing with water. So we've been pushing, as part of the Greater New Orleans Water Collaborative, to get greener stormwater infrastructure and use existing monies to really implement some of those things. And made some good progress, but there's still a lot of work to move forward.
One thing New Orleans has, one bill we tried to get through the legislature last year was to not build schools on toxic waste sites. So we got it through the House, but the Senate committee killed it because there is a division in New Orleans between the different New Orleans school affiliations to rebuild this school. So you would think that that would be a no-brainer, but in Baton Rouge, I reminded our senator that we did have a school, and it's an African-American community in Baton Rouge, built on top of an old dump. And he said, oh, yeah, but I can imagine so that is a simple thing that you would think that maybe you can do brownfield this property for a storage warehouse or something, but not something that kids, that are going to be attending all the time and being exposed to. So that legislation will probably come up again. Don't build a school on a toxic waste site. So.
Yes.
Given that the state's budget crisis is now something like $3 billion over the next 2 years, what do you see as the greatest threats in that realm toward the coastal projects and taking money from the Coastal Trust Fund?
Well, I was pleased that in the governor's special address a couple weeks ago, when he talked about the budget shortfall, he explicitly said that they're not going to take money from coastal funds for that budget shortfall. So hopefully he continues to stand strong on that, because it's important that we, implement this plan. It's a 50-year plan, and if we don't get started now, we can't just, it's going to get worse and worse.
Right now there is a strong feeling among everyone that the coastal money should be protected. What we're looking at is probably better leadership in CPRA to not approve something like the Ram Coal Terminal to go through. And for coastal money, and this is a real, they passed legislation that CPRA would clean up a site, a hazardous waste site, because the Corps would not go forward with the hazardous waste in place on a particular project. Well, the CPRA did not go after the responsible party. So if you're going to when you start doing these diversion projects and these large projects, you're going to run into oil and gas problems that haven't been cleaned up. So I think one of our big efforts is to make sure that the responsible parties pay for this and not coastal restoration money used to clean up oil and gas problems. But I feel kind of confident that the coastal restoration money will be used for coastal restoration, but it's we need to make that agency make sure that they go after responsible parties when they run into problems.
Right behind you, you've had your hand up for a while. Yeah.
Okay. This is more directed toward Anne, but I was curious, like you mentioned, like movement building, and I was curious about sort of like consumer activism through like what is everyday person, what can we do like not through legislature to sort of like not support these systems. Obviously like from biking and not going on airplanes and stuff, but like from like choices, you go to the grocery store, everything is going to be like packaged in this material, that plastic, which is like also supporting like these industries that are taking from the communities and disenfranchising people. So like how much do you think within the scope of like movement building, how much capacity is there for like changing the paradigm back to like local growing stuff, not plastic wrapped? Is that feasible in your belief?
Oh, yeah.
There's a huge movement
Yes.
of plastic-free activists.
Yes, I know.
And the Plastic-Free July. Do you think that's something that collectively people could get on board with as a way to change and build a movement, and then also then create a national scope on this collective decision to use their consumer activism to change the way legislature is formed?
Well, I think you just made a very good case for it, right? Well done. That's a whole movement in itself, and I think that it's probably still in this part of the world a very radical idea. I completely agree with it. What's the story of stuff, right? Gets to that and looks at how, why do we all have to have a new iPhone? Right, my coworker called about me I have a cracked screen, of course, and the operator sort of kind of made fun of me via her for having, not having the latest phone. I mean, what is this about? So I think absolutely. I mean, why do I have to crack through industrial plastic, to get a fork or, whatever it is that I happen to buy? Why do we have to buy stuff? Why can't we have swap meets, et cetera? I mean, I think you're right on. I think it is still considered a very radical idea. I saw this great presentation once by Vandana Shiva, if anybody knows her, that great Indian activist on GMOs, and she links it all to our economy, right? And that we always have to grow. And how does this country do that? Because we all have to keep buying junk that a lot of us don't even really need. She says the only other organism that has growth as its paradigm for existence is cancer, a tumor. Yeah, that's it. So I completely agree, and keep it going, and someday that'll be, center stage as it ought to be.
I'd like to get a couple more questions since we started late, and I saw one over here, and then I'll take you after that. And, sir, I think you had your hand up for a while.
Yes, I almost remember. It's a point that Robin, you made, and I do believe that there's information out there and there's actually people acting on it, but I think it's important to give voice to. And that being is that there's approximately, 41% of the Mississippi Basin watershed. And the states north of us, which I think includes most of them, they are very active, to my appreciation, in terms of working on pollutants and working on sediment. In fact, it might have some effect on our sediment diversion here. And my question then generally is, it seems to me in terms of coalition, the dead zone, etc., that in terms of coalition, that is there a organization or organizations out there where there's actually coordination going on from the upper Mississippi all the way down to the dead zone that perhaps could act as a political force given the number of states in terms of federal regulation?
Yeah, we're a member of the Mississippi River Collaborative, which is a coalition of groups all along the main stem of the Mississippi River that are working together to address nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that leads to the dead zone. We could certainly have more political power, though. But we meet twice a year, talk about shared strategy and talk about ways to work together. And one of the things that we've done is to push the EPA to actually come up with nitrogen and phosphorus limits for each of the states. And we actually sued them because they wouldn't even come up with these standards. They're like, we don't have to. And that's currently in the courts right now.
So I kind of have a two-part question. And the first is, we were talking earlier about how the state kind of rolls over for the oil industry and lets them just do whatever they want for the most part. My question is, realistically speaking, it would seem like we have the power in terms of it's our coast. Like, are you really going to go to the Florida coast? Like, if you want our market, you have to abide by our rules. So I feel like the power is on us to set the standard. I'm originally from California, and I've often read like the best 100 companies to work for or whatever, always in like a lot of them happen to be in California because California is like, we have the highest population in the country. If you want access to our market, you have to play by our rules. So it's kind of like Chase or whatever isn't really that great. They just want access to the market, so they have to play by the rules set by the state. So is that realistic here is the first question. The second is to kind of go, obviously the paradigm shift at the local level is great, but why not include legislation? How much would policies change and the electorate change if the electors, if the electorate had more information? How much is there like a push to actually educate, Joe Schmo voter about who is in office, what their last vote was in terms of all these issues that we obviously care about? Like, I mean, I listen to the news, but I'm not Joe Schmo voter. I'm like obsessive compulsive NPR consumer, which is a different market. And I'm sure there's lots more of me in this room.
This is one of the reasons we used to put out an environmental scorecard. So we're starting up again with an environmental scorecard to try to hold some of these people responsible for what they do. The folks in Louisiana are coming from a background that they're told that their jobs depend upon these plants. A lot of these plants do not manufacture. They create the raw material. They create the plastic, but not the plastic product. So you have the oil refineries. You're going to have oil shipped out someplace else. So people will work to do make in the process, but we don't actually have. We're not going to be selling things. They're not going to be purchasing things. Every time this happens, we have economists come. There's maybe 2 or 3 economists in the state that everyone relies on, and they come and they say, if you open another plant, you are going to have 50,000 jobs. And they were using, if you're into economics, they were using multipliers of 7. If we had every job that was promised by an economist down at the legislature, we would all be employed 300%. It is, and no one ever calls them on it. We had an environmental study done one time, and we had to get a group out of the Northwest called Eco Northwest to come and do an environmental study, and that's been quite some time ago. But it's very difficult in Louisiana to get an environmental economist, someone who actually does a true cost-benefit analysis of the impacts of pollution on your health, on your property values, on just your quality of life. And so it is extremely difficult that because you have maybe 3 economists or maybe probably 1 who comes to the legislature all the time and just says, we're going to create a bazillion more jobs. And they've gone, since they were called on the multipliers, they've gone down to maybe 3, which is probably more appropriate. If you don't know what I mean, it's like for every plant job that's created, you're going to create 3 jobs for the grocery store that sells stuff, or the gas station or whatever. It's going to create more jobs. So it has failed terribly, and no one calls the state on it. So when I go to the legislature, all of us go to the legislature, we're at the point is where we want the companies to do things correctly. You're not going to shut down Exxon. You're not going to shut down Dow. They're going to pack their bags when they feel like it. And so, but we have to demand that whatever process they use, whatever discharges they have, are done within a certain parameter and are done safely. So that's what we're doing.
And if I can just add one tiny bit, I think it's an existential question. Yes, why don't we assert ourselves to the industry? Who knows, Bob Marshall, who was a columnist at the Picayune and now works for the Lens, and he was on a panel yesterday, had this great column that was a headline after BP, and it said Stockholm Syndrome or spousal abuse. And it was exploring what is it with Louisiana and our inability to do, as you suggest, sort of demand certain things. Is it that we believe it, or that we're just abused and we can't stop? It's a question.
I think we have to wrap up here, but let's keep the dialogue going. Speakers.
I have these if
Oh, great.
somebody should take them.